I'm Jess, and it's so great to be with you for a few moments today. Welcome to Kingston Standard Church, our online version. I'd love to invite you to connect with us online or in person. If you're in the Kingston area, come on out. We would love to see you. If you're limited to online connection though, not a problem. Just be sure to check out our website for at-home worship resources. But in the description box of this video, you're going to find the link to our website. As well, you can always follow us on YouTube and like us on Facebook, and be sure to subscribe to both so that you'll stay up to date on all the new content when it's posted. We have a variety of resources available to families and kids on both Facebook and YouTube, so if this is your first time joining us, or if you've been here before, we want to encourage you to go ahead and check that out. Because our mission is to equip families for the conversations that they have together to learn and grow and follow Jesus. And if you want to touch base personally, then feel free to reach out. You can send us a message on Facebook, or you can use the address below. So let's dive in and see what we're going to learn about today.
A few years ago, I had the privilege of being able to take a kayak course in the ocean. And one of the many things that they taught us, some on dry land and some in the water, the one item was called a T-Rescue. Now, for me to describe it, I chose to just put it in a video, and so over my shoulder you'll see the whole process of what it takes to learn how to do the T-Rescue. The T-Rescue, as you can see, involves rolling your kayak into the water and, in effect, hanging upside down in the water, underwater, in the boat. Now, it's kind of a step process that is part of the learning curve to get to the place where you know how to do the full roll. But the instructor took some time on land to say, here's what we're going to do, and then everybody had to make the decision, are we going to go for it? Are we going to hang upside down in the ocean water? And so this group that I was a part of, we were all gung-ho. I mean, we were there, we wanted to learn everything that we could that they were willing to teach us. But we had to get in the water, and we had to be willing to hang upside down. This, for most people, is the biggest fear they have about kayaks, isn't it? The idea that a kayak could tip over and they would be kind of stuck somehow in it. Or maybe that the water was too cold. Or maybe that, it would be challenging if salt water got into their nose. Maybe they didn't want to get wet. Ultimately, like the instructor said, everybody has to make the decision as to whether or not they're willing to get out into the water and get wet. That's kind of the way life works sometimes, right? We all have to decide from time to time if we're willing to follow through, if we're willing to go all in when it comes to what we know and then what we decide to put into practice. Now today, as we look at this faith hack, action breathes life into faith. There's a point where we realize on our journey with Jesus that we can only go so far if we're just willing to dip our toe in the water. Will we take the full dive into the ocean? Now, likely we've all had questions at different points in time as to what it means to go all in following Jesus. And that's a great thing for us to have those kind of questions. Last time we were together, we looked at the life of faith and how the test often precedes the lesson. That was our first faith hack. Now today, as we explore this faith hack, many of us realize that this can be an issue of faith and action that gets pulled into multiple directions. The Apostle Paul could be understood to say actions don't matter. But in the context of what he's saying, he's made a statement, salvation is by faith alone, to a group of people who were really trying to earn God's favor with their activity. They kind of seem to see life a little bit like a scale, that if they put enough good stuff on one side of the scale, then, and they didn't have too much bad stuff on the other side of the scale, then God would be proud and their good deeds would outweigh their bad deeds and they would be accepted by God. Well, Paul is helping us to see that the purpose of our actions is not to try and create space in God's kingdom. The faith and confidence we have in the sacrifice of Jesus is what creates space in God's kingdom for us. But ultimately, James, on the other side, could be interpreted to say, well, it's only actions that matter. He's dealing with a group of people that kind of approach life, well, as long as I believe something about God, then I'm all good. But they were living like practical atheists who said they believe in God but didn't live any way differently as a result of their faith. The actions that they kind of followed through on were like they were separate from what they said they believed. And this is what James is addressing here. He's saying the activity of daily life is actually a part of one of the keys of faith, that action breathes life into faith. Let's see how he comments on it here in James chapter 2, verses 14 through 26. What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith but has no deeds? Can such faith save them? Suppose a brother or sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you says to them, "Go in peace, keep warm and well fed," but does nothing about their physical needs, what good is it? In the same way, faith by itself is not, if it's not accompanied by action, is dead. But someone will say, well, you have faith and I have deeds. He said, well, you show me your faith without deeds, and I will show you my faith because of my deeds. You believe that there's one God. Well, that's good. Even demons, though, believe that, and they shudder. You are a foolish person. Do you want evidence that faith without deeds is really useless? Was not our father Abraham considered righteous for what he did when he offered his son Isaac on the altar? You see that his faith and actions were working together, and his faith was made complete by what he did. And the scripture was fulfilled that says, Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. And he was called God's friend. You see that a person is considered righteous by what they do, and not just by faith alone. In the same way, was not Rahab the prostitute considered righteous for what she did when she gave lodging to the spies and sent them off in a different direction? As the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without deeds is dead. Now, James hits on a lot of compelling issues here for us as it relates to how our faith is connected to our actions. He talks about how we treat the poor, and he talks about how easy it is to believe something but then still not even realize we're not part of the kingdom. And he's talking about dealing with difficult direction from God when he talks about Abraham, and he's talking about risks that require us to trust God, sometimes without a safety net, with Rahab. So as we think about what it means for action to breathe life into faith, let's look at two ways in particular that he just kind of highlights what's happening as it relates to our actions and our faith. Let's unpack the first statement, which is really that action shows a life of faith. Now, if we were to look back into the Old Testament, many of you might remember a character by the name of Daniel and the three friends that he had with him who were new refugees in Babylon. And as they arrived in Babylon, there was a different set of rules as far as food was concerned, and they had trusted God that if they lived under his food direction, that God would bless their lives. So now they're in a new context, and really what's at issue here is the food that they would eat would ultimately give credit for the strength that they had, for their intelligence, for their ability to work, for how competent they were. And so who was going to get credit for the strength and intelligence and the way that they were living life. Was it going to be the food from the king's table, which ultimately had been blessed or given to idols, and so the idols of Babylon would get the credit? Or would it be the food that had followed God's direction, and would Jehovah God receive the credit? Well, there was a risk to kind of push for a diet that would meet their faith. But as they went through that, if you check out the story in the book of Daniel in the Old Testament, you'll find that turns out they were stronger, smarter, faster than the others, even just after a few days. Now, if you break this whole thing down, and it even breaks down in our own lives in the same way, there are two elements that are at work in Daniel's life. There's two elements that James is really talking about here, and he's referring to how faith is one piece, that's one element, the fact that we believe in our minds and in our hearts and with our lives that God can be trusted. But also there's the action, which is to trust that He'll work out the details of our lives, whether they be good or bad, as we honor Him. And we get to see in Daniel's life how this worked out. And the life example that he is of faith and action working together, the purpose is not for us to go, well, Daniel is special and he's, different than everybody else. The point is that God is faithful, and as we go all in with Him, we can trust Him. Now, that's the kind of trust James is referring to in our passage that we read just a few minutes ago. There are actions that rely on God even when the end is not completely clear. That's demonstrating faith with our action, showing our faith, giving when it might be a risk, standing when it might have a cost. And our time is no different than theirs. There's lots of things for us to sort through and say, what should I stand for? What do I really need to get kind of worked up and make sure that I'm following through and trusting God in the midst of it? And as we do that, I would encourage you to make sure that it's really a God thing and it's not just a personal preference thing along the way. But in all these, it would have been a lot easier to go with the flow for Abraham or for Rahab or for Daniel and his friends, just to not make waves. And James is helping us to see through their example, and additionally through Daniel, that action shows a life of faith. But he also helps us to see here in the book of James that action grows a life of faith. As we said, he mentions Abraham, Rahab, and the life of faith that grew in their lives as a result of their follow-through. Now, in my own personal life, I wouldn't say that I started out as a kid with a brilliant star shining in my life that related to faith. As a kid in church, I tended to like the music, and so when we would go to church, after each song, I would turn to my mom and say, "Is it time yet?" Which to me meant that if the pastor was getting up to speak, I had other distractions to keep myself busy. Sometimes it was to lay down and go to sleep. Sometimes it was to time myself on my watch to see how long I could hold my breath. There were all kinds of different activities that I would be a part of that were part of being there in church that were okay to keep my mind and body occupied. So I wouldn't say I was the most engaged young man when it came to faith. But somewhere along the way, I was invited, and I did follow through, to volunteer as a kids helper in the 5-year-olds class in our church. Now, basically, I would get down on the floor and I would kind of play or, do puzzles or different things. Every now and then, some of them would end up climbing up on my back, and so there were times when I was a little bit like a human jungle gym. But ultimately, as I kind of walked through this, I was engaged with a variety of other adults and seeing what faith looked like in their life in addition to my own family. And too many of my friends, they kind of quit early. They kind of walked away from faith. They weren't really kind of diving in or getting into it and discovering what it really meant to follow Jesus. In my case, being exposed to some of these adults and having an opportunity to see their lives in action actually grew my faith. It helped me to discover how their actions really were follow through on their faith, and that was much more engaging for me. Now, it wasn't just some kind of a magic zap moment where I all of a sudden realized all of this in my life. It was a slow process of discovery. But as I look back, the action that I took to volunteer actually helped grow my faith. Now, James gives us the picture with Abraham and Rahab, and even in the other example with the poor, of how it's not because of what we know, and it's not because, anybody's really any different than us. It's not because of some accident of time that pulled them through and they could all of a sudden follow up on their best intentions. The actions that they implemented were very intentional. But it took more than just I want to do that someday. It was stepping into a place of confidence and trust with God, following through on what they knew about God in order to take a new step that might have been a risk. And what they did with what they know caused their faith to grow. So James is helping us to see that action helps grow a life of faith. Now, many of us may have made statements along the way that someday I hope to be more consistent. I hope to have a healthier faith, or to be more generous, better connected, more present. And sometimes we end up making those well-intentioned statements as if there would be some magic moment that would come along someday where there'll be a load of time or money or energy that will drop into our lap. And then we end up walking away from that moment and falling back into some of the same old habits that we know we need to change in order to better engage with Jesus. Now, the hard truth for all of us that sometimes is very harsh but yet difficult to follow through on is that we always carve out the time and the money and the energy to do what we really want to do, don't we? What we really want to do, we always have time and money and energy to make happen. So James recognizes that, and he says, action actually breathes life into our faith. So today, maybe there's a place of risk, like Daniel, where your faith needs to have an opportunity to show. Perhaps there's a place of engaging and following through, whether it's volunteering or engaging with someone along the way, where it'll give your faith an opportunity to grow. But what James really gets down to here is the question if we'll decide whether or not we're willing to go all in. Are we willing to get into the water and get wet? He's pretty clear. If we want to grow our faith, if we want to show our faith, it's not just about hearing what we should do. It's about purposefully following through, isn't it? Because action breathes life into faith.
Thanks again for joining us today. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channels, or if you're watching this on Facebook, then you can like and follow us there. And it would mean so much to us if you took a moment to comment, like, and share this video so that others are able to enjoy it as well. And hey, if you're in the Kingston area, come on out. We would love to see you. Please know, though, that you are loved and that we're praying for you. And we certainly appreciate your prayers too. We'll see you soon.